Thanks for joining us today on Mormon Land, where we explore news in and about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I'm Managing Editor Dave Noyce. I oversee the Salt Lake Tribune's faith coverage. I'm joined again by Senior Religion Reporter Peggy Fletcher-Stack. Hello, Peggy.
Hi, Dave.
We remind our listeners about another way to support Mormon Land. Just go to patreon.com, where with a donation as small as $3 a month, you can access transcripts to our podcast, our complete newsletter, and all of our exclusive religion coverage. Again, that's Patreon, patreon.com/Mormonland. Now for today's show. The Utah Area Presidency of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints sent a memo last month to the faith's lay leaders in the Beehive State, urging their congregations to join a September celebration of the U.S. Constitution. Nothing remarkable about that. Church teachings and culture have long embraced America's founding and the role its governing document plays. But the missive also endorsed a grassroots group with ties to conservative, some say extremist causes. This seemed to run counter to the First Presidency's recently updated commitment to political neutrality and its warning against straight-ticket partisan loyalties. So what's happening here? Were these dual directives or dueling directives? Can the church and its members honor the Constitution in some formal way without drifting into partisan polarization? Joining us today in studio to discuss those issues and more are two Latter-day Saints with extensive public service backgrounds. Stuart Tuttle, a career diplomat who recently served as chief of mission at the U.S. Embassy in Panama, and Lou Kramer, who helped found the World Trade Center Utah, served as assistant commerce secretary in the Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush administrations, and as director general of the U.S. Commercial Service. Stuart, Lou, welcome.
Thank you. Delighted to be here.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Glad to have you. Hey, Stuart, let me start with you. And something a little separate from some of what we've just talked about. As a Foreign Service officer who spent much of your life outside the U.S., how do other officials and people in other countries view the U.S. Constitution, if they give it any thought at all?
Yeah, well, I think one thing that's very important to note when you're working overseas is there you really begin to appreciate and notice the distinctions in your own country, right? You can really see it best when you're far away. And one thing that's, I think, very clear is the U.S. Constitution has, been an inspiration to many other nations, sort of a guidepost to how they should orient themselves. But at the same time, it has maintained, at least from what I've seen, a level of sort of purity and simplicity that has allowed it to stand a test of time that many other constitutions in other countries haven't been able to. If you'll notice that if you take a look at most constitutions in other countries, they tend to be much longer than the U.S. Constitution. They tend to be much more prescriptive in terms of the rights and responsibilities they lay out. They're much more like legislation. And that, of course, makes them much more controversial and much more subject, as it were, to pressure to start from scratch. And we have a constitution that's stood the test of time for going on now 240 years. That's pretty impressive for all its imperfections. And I would note that, the Constitution, for as wonderful it is, ultimately is a document that is based on how should I say this within the faith context, the philosophies of men. Right. And as a man of faith, I'm certainly not going to slavishly adhere to any particular interpretation of a philosophy or philosophies of men, whether that be a constitutional interpretation, a political party platform, or a particular ideology. Right. I mean, I think it's important to step back and look at the fundamentals. And I think the Constitution has kept those fundamentals pretty secure for a very long time. It's something we should be very proud of.
And we'll probably talk a little bit more about that later, too. So, Lou, now let's turning to the current effort celebrating the Constitution in Utah, especially. What did you think of the proposal when you were invited to join the organizing committee for this? And why were you excited about doing it?
Well, I think it was particularly exciting because I do believe in the Constitution as an inspired document, but I also believe that our children and grandchildren need to have that same kind of feeling. I had the honor of serving in the Ronald Reagan administration, and he said on many occasions, we are only a generation away from losing freedom. And that depends on what kind of training and education, whether in the home, family, church, or otherwise, comes on such things as we agree, I think, as an inspired document in so many ways. May I also, if I could, build on the comments. Reason why I'm so supportive of this kind of opportunity is that I lived 3 years in Asia as a young boy. My father was a career Army officer there, and I come from a long line of soldiers all the way back to Mormon Battalion and the Revolutionary War, and I'm a former Army officer myself. But I also saw, as an LDS missionary in Berlin, in the depths of the Cold War, living a few blocks from the infamous Berlin Wall, what difference freedom really does make. And that makes when you're sitting there in, as they called it in those days, Spy City, 120 miles inside the Iron Curtain, and hearing numerous stories about the communists on one side and the other, it was a pretty clear line that the Constitution makes a difference for us. And since then, I also had the privilege of putting the first cell phones in Hungary, Czech, Slovakia, Poland, as the wall was falling, seeing the difference that freedom, communication, and loyalty can make in a person's life. So I have a personal commitment as well as a faith commitment and a Ronald Reagan commitment to the power of the United States Constitution. One final comment. Ronald Reagan used to say that if you're at a border and there's a gate and the gate goes up, which way do the people go? And you know how that went in Berlin. They didn't head into East Berlin. And a friend last night was telling me, I said I was going to have the privilege of being with this Mormon Land broadcast. She said, you got to understand, China and Russia have no immigration problems. No one is trying to get in at their borders. So the gate doctrine works well. And I'm grateful that we are blessed by this Constitution in our wonderful land.
So what about this committee?
Oh, well, for all those reasons, thank you. Were you ever a trial lawyer? Thank you, Peggy. So when this opportunity came, and it was as a result of the legislature at this last session with, I think, 70-2 in the House and 27-0 in the Senate, agreeing that we needed to reaffirm our commitment to the principles of the Constitution and appreciation for our founding fathers. And also, patriotism is an engine for good. It ought to be a unifying proposal and not causing this kind of difficulty. And so when this opportunity came along, I said, sure, I'd be happy to help. The big picture was, I love America. I want to be helpful to this. And the First Area Presidency, I think, understands that, there's some cynicism right now about America in so many ways, justifiably so, as Stuart was saying. And so this committee was put together, but it's new, it's in formation. And Peggy made some excellent recommendations that we need to have some more diversity on it. And I said, well, yeah, we just got started. I've been out of town. Let's get some more diversity. And so that's why my dear friend Scott Howell and talking with Ben McAdams and others, we are intending to make this a much more diverse and representative collection of supporters of the freedoms we have in America. So that's the overall picture.
So you weren't worried about it, just yourself, that the makeup having no known Democrats on it when you joined?
I didn't know the affiliation. It's intended to be a nonpartisan, non-denominational, American way of supporting the Constitution. And I was out of town for the weeks as it was in formation back east. When I came back, I said, hey, these are Americans. That's how I look at it. And in my long career, you can guess which party I'm a member of, having served in the Reagan administration, but my fun friends are Democrats, including this handsome gentleman, Scott Howell, sitting here.
I believe that's our campaign motto. So I don't know.
Have more fun. And also diverse faiths as well. This is really intended to be non-denominational. And as soon as I got back, and with Peggy's recommendation, I put a contact into Ben and to Scott and said, let's look at some smart ways to make this for everybody, not just a certain group. So it was speeding up, and September was coming. So I think that's why there was a little bit of probably not as much reflection that I probably should have brought to the meetings at that time. But it is intended to be for all people, all faiths, all parties, all Americans. We are blessed to live in a country that allows that kind of thing to happen. And that's why I love America.
So when did you become aware that David Barton, who's a very controversial evangelical Christian speaker, had been invited to be a keynote speaker?
I think when I was sitting with you.
You didn't know about that before?
No. There's so many activities going on, the Freedom Festival, the Liberty Week. Mm-hmm. There's a whole host of it across the entire state, including visiting every town with with a message. So that was news to me. I don't know. I really am not aware of David Barton. I am aware of a lot of the other activities going on. I spend a lot of my time worrying about the commercial real estate world right now and international issues. So, and I've brought those concerns to the forefront after you mentioned it to me last week, Peggy.
Do you know anything about him?
I mean, I've done some reading on him. I haven't read his works. I was already aware of him. Mm-hmm. I also aware of the reviews of his work. And I mean, I have not admittedly read his work in part because of that. Look, I mean, you only have so much time in your life, right? When I read history, I prefer to read history from historians. I might not agree with what they say, but at least I know where they're coming from and what their background and training is. In terms of his participation in this event, obviously, not something I will have anything to do with in making those determinations. He clearly is somebody, on a positive sense, who loves the Constitution, right? Who believes that it's an important document, who believes that it is founded on sort of core moral principles that are present in Christianity. So those are all things that are positive, but no doubt he is a polarizing political figure. And in that sense, I mean, at least from my perspective, it seems an odd choice to sort of highlight a prominent event in this initiative that seems to be aimed at a broad cross-section of society, given the woeful levels of ignorance about the Constitution and other terms, subjects in general civics that we find all around us. And this is an effort, it seems to me, to help everybody understand the Constitution more and appreciate it. And in that sense, perhaps it might be better to have somebody who wasn't quite so polarizing. But if it's determined that this is somebody whose message is very important, it might be worth looking at some alternatives as well, some people who might also be dedicated to preserving the Constitution, appreciate the Constitution, but might have a different perspective on it to also share his or her vision. Just a suggestion.
Sorry, Lou. I'm sorry, Stuart. What about, Lou, this Why I Love America group, which ends up having to have some ties that raised a lot of questions? Well,
I actually went back and looked at the committee makeup, and Peggy's article was not accurate as far as overlap on the committees. And I brought some information on that to show that, I mean, 2/3 of them are not on the Why I Love America committee. I took it at the high level, at 30,000 feet. Why do I love America? And I know no matter who speaks, there's going to be controversy. Your former boss, Senator Rubio, I'm sure he'd be an interesting choice in Utah too. So there are enough other activities out there that we hope that there'll be some kind of balance. And I personally have invited Scott Howell to participate in some of these things as a speaker as well. And again, this is all in the preliminary stages. And I was focused pretty intently on getting the booklet prepared and other things without looking at all the other activities that are slated for the coming September, being the Constitutional Month. But St. George is doing things, Logan's done things at Freedom Festival Hall. And I know this is something now that people are reviewing and making sure, as Stuart has said, as the best possible positive outcome. I want to get more patriotism in this world, particularly for my kids and grandkids. And if this is an attempt to start the dialogue, then perhaps all the better.
It seems like now it could be difficult to given now that there's attention on this and that it at least came across to many observers as a little one-sided, that it might be hard now to get people from the other side to take part. Do you know what I'm saying? In other words, now I don't want to be tied to that because it's going to put me with that group. And that's what someone might be thinking. Do you agree with that, Lou? Or is it can anything that needs to be mended be mended?
Well, I would hope so. We are Americans. We are a unifying state. President Nelson says we're peacemakers. I'm not looking to have contention. I would really like folks to say, gee, I don't agree with this, but hey, they may not agree with me on something else. So, and having I believe that I have very good friends on all sides of the aisle, not just both sides, but all sides of the aisle and all faiths as well, that we can make this work. Looking at this as the lightning rod seems to me to be kind of short-sighted when the broader vision is why I love America. And okay, I love America because we can have these kind of discussions and this freedom. We can have the rights of this, and it comes with responsibilities. And those responsibilities include saying, I will listen to people with other viewpoints. So it seems to me in my humble life that there are too many focus on one event when there's so many other things out there that could be positive. We'll see what happens. And it was a surprise. Literally, until Peggy told me about this, I was looking at the whole spectrum and not just one event.
So, Stuart, you're an outsider on this, admittedly. Yeah. What's your take from the outside looking in on this as to what the Utah area presidency sent? This memo, kind of embracing some of these, which may not have been known at the time, more controversial. Right. What would you recommend as an outsider, and what's your take on this?
Well, I mean, first of all, I'll emphasize that I certainly don't question the church's motivations in pushing forward this initiative. I think I applaud it. I think it's a great thing. And these, when you start getting into these type of issues, imagine how many issues the church deals with. And I'll talk about this from my perspective, having run an embassy overseas, all the issues that I had to deal with, the 40 agencies that worked in my mission and all their particular missions. For me to be an expert on any one of those things and delve into the details was very difficult, and often it didn't happen. I really relied on those people below me to funnel up to me the things I needed to know and the things I needed to do for them. So I'm sure I very much doubt that a lot of really detailed thought from the highest level has gone into some of these specifics, because these things have to be delegated out. But I believe the motivations are good, and I also believe that it's extremely important that it is seen as a broad initiative appealing to all people. I think it's interesting looking at the United States from outside. We feel very polarized, and our dialogue is very polarized, and it's very difficult to get things done in Congress, and these things really bother us, and it is indeed a shame. But it's curious from overseas to look, because the fact is you realize that Americans in the end are not that divided when it comes to their ideology and their thinking. Frankly, if you went to any other democracy, any other U.S. ally, as we would call them, almost anywhere in the world, and you put Joe Biden in that country, he would be a center-right politician. The U.S. Democratic Party would be a centrist party, right? Mm-hmm. We are actually not that extreme. There are individuals who probably are on both ends of the spectrum, but on the whole, we are not, which is one of the points that makes it so frustrating that we have trouble getting along, because we are not really that divided on what we think compared to other places that seem to work okay, right? So I think that ultimately comes down to a willingness to sit down and talk through these issues, recognize the good in others, and give them the benefit of the doubt. And frankly, as a career diplomat, I've had to carry a very apolitical posture my whole life. Mm-hmm. That's the only way you can do it, because no matter who's in power, you have to move forward their initiatives unless you want to resign, which I haven't felt I needed to up to this point. Mm-hmm. And in doing so, I've met hundreds of politicians from both parties who've come overseas to visit. And I've quickly learned that the party had nothing to do with whether that person was smart, whether that person was nice, whether that person cared what I had to say, whether that person treated people with respect, whether that person took his or her job seriously. That was all the individual. And you quickly learn that party affiliation has little to do with whether or not somebody is able to get the job done for the American people. And I think in the same sense, it should have little to do with how you move forward an initiative like this that should be designed to create a sense of patriotism across the board among Americans and people who live there, irrespective of their particular political persuasion.
So let's talk a little bit about the pamphlet that you think is going to be sent. I mean, that you're hoping will be sent out. Apparently, is it your understanding the area presidency is sending that pamphlet to all lay leaders in Utah?
Peggy, yes, but that's also like 60,000 of these have already been distributed or ordered by the State Board of Education, I believe, but also by the the League of City and State
Towns,
cities and towns, and it's intended to be for fifth or sixth grader education, pretty straightforward, and again, nonpartisan. Have
you read it?
Oh yeah, I have.
A question for both of you, and do you think the U.S. is a Christian nation, and do you think that's what the founders' intention was, Stuart?
I mean, the United States was not founded as a specifically Christian nation, right? I mean, the Constitution itself is non-denominational, right? And it appears to me that it was designed to be able to embrace all those who want to come to this country and live in goodwill with their neighbors, whatever their religious persuasion. Obviously, the context of the development of the Constitution in the early republic was a Christian one, which is fine and is based on sort of basic principles of morality that Christianity promotes, that are also promoted by Judaism, Islam, every great religious tradition, as well as by many who don't actually profess a religion. Those foundational principles that came from the Christian environment in which those founders lived are a foundation of the Constitution, but they're non-denominational and not even specific to Christianity. To me, there's no such reference in the Constitution.
Yeah. So right. What about you?
One nation under God, people can, in their own mind, say, who is your supreme being? But the impact, of course, in our church is it was divinely inspired, and that again is from above, and that's sufficient. I like what Stuart said. He and I think, probably had the same constitutional law syllabus, which was this was open for all people and was a refuge for them to come for freedom of their religion. And one of the first synagogues in Utah, Brigham Young provided space for that. I mean, Rabbi Spector's talked about that. It's certainly now a multicultural, multi-religion nation, which is one of the powerful things when you go overseas. You say, hey, listen, I'm a Muslim. I'll be treated better in the United States than I am treated in many of the other countries around the world. So it is, whether, or not, it is today a multi-religious and multicultural nation.
So President Dallin Oaks did in 2021 in his general conference talk, talked about the U.S. Constitution, which was kind of unusual. He sensed a kind of urgency. He said, while Latter-day Saints believe the founding U.S. document is, quote, inspired, that does not mean that God dictated every word and phrase. He pointed out, for example, the need for inspired amendments that abolished slavery and gave women the right to vote. How can the Constitution be celebrated in this month, but in a nuanced way, not in a over-glorified, over-simplified, it's all perfect, word dictated by God? Both of you.
Well, maybe I can start by saying, first of all, I think we shouldn't be triumphalist about the Constitution or our country or anything else. I mean, everything is a work in progress. As I said, the Constitution is an amalgamation of philosophies of men, very bright men who worked then it was all men. Now, if it was redone, it would be women as well. But it was people who worked very, very hard to study what they thought were the best examples around the world of government and try to put together a new radical experiment in government based on those philosophies. I have no doubt that these particular individuals were provided this opportunity to be in the world at this time to be able to carry out this work. It was up to them whether they did or not. That they did is commendable. And I think that's what we mean by we say inspired. They were in the right place at the right time and used the best of their ability to produce something that turned out to be remarkable and an example to the world and really an earthquake in terms of principles of government that based its foundation on the people. Right? Not the masters, but the people. And we still believe that, and we have every reason to be proud of it. But because of that, we have a reason to be informed and appreciative and to work hard to see that this Constitution continues to be improved and polished over time as we reach better understandings of our community and confront circumstances that the founders could never have conceived of. We have a country much larger, much more complicated, much more diverse than anything they ever had in mind. And this Constitution they created has proved adaptable to that. We need to continue to work with it to make sure it continues to be the fantastic foundational document that it has been, whether that's through amendment or through responsible judicial interpretation, whatever that might be, so that the Constitution remains relevant for our country as it moves forward.
But how do you celebrate that?
Well, I think that is how you celebrate it. First of all, you celebrate it by helping people to understand it. What is the Constitution? Why was it necessary? what did it correct, and why has it stood the test of time? That doesn't require you to get into debates about its meaning or get into debates about, whether you're going to be an originalist or something else, right? Those are for law school. Help people to understand what it is, why it was necessary. Remember, the Constitution was necessary because the country was falling apart because the federal government wasn't strong enough. Right? So it was created to actually strengthen the national government while at the same time constraining it. That is pretty impressive. Strengthen and constrain at the same time. It's almost miraculous they pulled it off. That is something worth celebrating. And we're still here under that same Constitution hundreds of years later. And no other country can say that. In fact, it's rather interesting that the two most perhaps impressive democratic nations in the world over the last couple of centuries are the United States with a very, very simple constitution and the United Kingdom, which doesn't even have a written constitution. That tells you how important flexibility and adaptability need to be in moving forward in response to new circumstances.
Lou.
Wow. I'll go with that. I will celebrate that. Well, we do celebrate the founding fathers and their wives that made this happen. I mean, their example required a moral people, which they've often said. John Adams made a big deal about that. Lincoln said, the Constitution is the political religion of our nation. And it's broad enough and expansive enough and flexible enough, as Stuart has said, to accommodate 330 million people today and be that shining city on a hill that Ronald Reagan says is worth defending. And it's important to celebrate it because we need to have a country that we believe is worthy of defending and preparing and educating the next generation. So all of those things make me excited. And the 300,000 people that showed up at the Freedom Festival last week, waving flags in Provo, I thought that was really great in Utah. So I'm trying to stay away from the law school side of it and look at hey, my kids have got to realize this is a real blessing. My son went on an LDS mission to the Philippines. He was there about 6 weeks. He said, every American teenager ought to go overseas and see what they're missing. It's really incredible. And I was rereading some Solzhenitsyn in the Gulag Archipelago recently, in the One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. And it's just thinking, we've forgotten how bad the USSR was. I was over in the USSR on the first mission that the White House had after Gorbachev became the general secretary in 1985. And it was so bleak. Unless you walk those streets and see those faces, those people, you don't realize what we're blessed with. One quick story. I have a friend, when I went back to Washington, D.C., been there a little while. He was out golfing with another one of his buddies. He was a partner in a law firm. My partner said, Richard, which wasn't his name, what would you do if you won the lottery? And Richard said back, hey, look, we won the lottery. I've got a U.S. passport. I live in America. So that's the kind of things that my kids need to see. My grandson was in Costa Rica last week on a service project, came home saying, we've got a pretty good deal going in America. So that's what I'd like to celebrate. We can talk about the specifics later, but we are really blessed. Patriotism is partly showing gratitude, and it's an engine for doing good by reaching out and solving these problems, getting together. That's the beauty, I think, the flexibility. We can actually meet with each other and, let's talk this out. We don't, call a lawyer or pull a gun or whatever else most of the time. We try and talk it out and make it work.
Let me go to, as we begin to wrap up, the church recently, the First Presidency, urged U.S. members not to vote a straight party ticket. They were pretty matter of fact about language that they haven't used before. Many, frankly, saw that as an ode to help Democrats and non-Republicans feel at home in the pews, especially younger Latter-day Saints, whom surveys show are less Republican. What do you think about this approach? Do you think it's healthy if the church is more, frankly, balanced in its partisan leanings of the members? Lou, do you want to start there?
No, I don't want to start there. I think that is terrific. And, we're, first of all, in my book, we're faithful members of a kingdom of God. Second of all, we're Americans. And maybe fourth or fifth or sixth down there, we're party members. But I have to be pretty candid. It's been tough being a Republican the last a little while. And that's why we have a group, the Ronald Reagan group, that gets together and talks about being common sense, moderate citizens. So I think it's a reflection of reality. I have 6 children. I don't think that any of them voted the same way I voted. And I'll put it on the record. I wrote in Gary Herbert and John Huntsman the last 4 primary and other elections because
for president. For
president, yeah. And I would write them in this time if I could convince my old friend John Huntsman to run. But I think the church is reflecting. It's got to be nonpartisan. It's a 501c3 organization, but it's also the reality. There are a lot of ways to serve in the United States of America without being a member of a given political party.
Stuart, what do you think?
Well, I mean, I found it refreshing. I mean, I have my own political predilections, but as I said, as a career diplomat, I'm quite political in my public face and how I deal with people because I have to deal with everyone. And in that process, I've come to have great respect for politicians of both parties. Yeah. I've also come to meet a few on both parties I didn't respect a lot, but I won't get into that, right? But on the whole, I've been quite impressed with our public servants, our legislators, much more impressed than the general public from polls, which is too bad because I think they actually are a lot smarter and work a lot harder than most people give them credit for on both sides of the aisle. So as I noted before, I mean, political parties, platforms, ideologies, these are human creations. So it's good, I think, to remind people that it's worth stepping back and taking a fresh look at what they believe.
Do you think that's a good place for the church to be, though?
Well, if the church...
beyond the institution, which we know has to be nonpartisan. If
the church perceives, I think it is good for the church to have a broad spectrum of members with different opinions on political issues, because on these issues, no one has necessarily the right answer, at least within a democratic framework. Yeah, if you're talking about dictatorship versus democracy, I think there can be a pretty clear line there. But within a democratic context, there's always more you can learn, especially from somebody who thinks differently from you. So to have a broader perspective, to require people to step back and rethink why they vote the way they do, why they support positions they do, to look at their own internal consistency, that is not a bad thing. And I think it's good for the country for them to take all these type of issues very seriously, not in knee-jerk fashion, but in very sort of self-reflective fashion. And let me just conclude by just emphasizing that, look, I've devoted my entire life to serving the American people. And that has required a lot of sacrifice, both from me and particularly from my family. But I've done it because I really believe that the United States of America is a great force for good in the world, and that we have a great deal to offer. And the Constitution is the foundation of that system, and it's something that we should all understand better. We should be proud of it, and we should work to perfect it, just as we work to perfect our country. And that requires us to work together, to stop the name calling, to stop the finger pointing, to give each other the benefit of the doubt, to sit down and have conversations, real conversations about solving real problems. We Americans are known as pragmatists, so it's time to show our pragmatism. I think this move by the church is an effort at pragmatism in the pews, and I applaud it.
So speaking of your experience, Stuart, the church is a global faith. Should it be spending so much time and energy talking about the U.S.?
That is an interesting question. I think inevitably it is going to, because the church is based in the United States. I mean, let's face it, when there's a lot of things that come up in General Conference that even people elsewhere in the United States have never heard of.
Yeah,
or they'll raise issues. They'll raise issues as if they're new. I can
even
remember
on this podcast.
Yeah, I can remember. I don't remember which general authority. I remember watching raising the issue of raves. Like this was a new phenomena, and they, they've been happening in D.C. for 10 years. Right? So I mean, when things happen in Utah, they get noticed and they get raised at General Conference. When things happen in the United States, they get noticed and they get raised at General Conference. That's not a criticism; it's just an acknowledgement of reality. I think as the church grows, becomes more diverse, you're going to hear more and more about a broader sort of focus. How can you have a broad focus? That'd be possible. Anyway, a broader discussion of world phenomena. But these things take time, and it depends who's up there. And, it's an evolution, a natural one. So it's not a criticism. It's just an observation.
So how is the church perceived globally in these countries?
Well, I mean, I think the church does a good job in trying to get out and project itself as a positive organization that works to help its members in the community. It's done that in the places where I've worked. I mean, granted, I've been in places where the church had very unique positions, such as Israel, where you weren't allowed to talk to anybody, and you basically had to have a guard at your church door to prevent a random person from walking in, right? So we are very, strictly adhere to the law wherever we are. But I mean, it is seen, if it is seen at all, as a positive organization. Sort of the negative stereotypes about the church that you'll often get in the United States, whether they come from the far right and the old traditional evangelical critics who made me suffer in high school in Southern California in the 80s, or from the left that sees the church as too credulous and engaged in too many conservative causes. Those same problems don't bubble as much up overseas. Often the problem is nobody knows what the church is or what you do. The problem really, for the most part, is ignorance of the church. And there it's just a matter of getting out more and helping the church to be understood.
Lou, final thoughts for you.
Well, thank you for this opportunity. I was just thinking about that excellent book that Peggy wrote about the various faiths. And only Peggy could have written that because it's so objective. And that's kind of, the world we live in today. And a man who's seen it all is Stuart around the world. I do know our humanitarian efforts are being recognized. I remember Senator Bennett used to say that people came back after a hurricane and said the only two people that helped us were the Mormons and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So there's still a lot of ignorance out there about what we do. But, the Book of Mormon, our scripture, our revelations are that the Constitution is a heavenly banner and that we live in a land that is choice above all other lands if we follow the one God that is over us all. So I'm excited about the opportunities to reach out to others not of our faith, not of our, perhaps of our political persuasions, and just say, we're in this together. Patriotism is an engine for doing good. We want to solve problems together. This is a way to do it. And, we'll work on some of the other things down the road, but the beauty is we can work on them. So it's been a pleasure to talk about this. I appreciate all that you do to keep this in the forefront and make us think about what we're doing and opening our eyes to what we could do better. And I just say, I love America and I love this opportunity to talk about it.
Stuart Tuttle, Lou Kramer, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thanks to Peggy Fletcher-Stack.
Always a pleasure.
And to our producer, Chris Samuels. We remind you that you can keep up on all the happenings in and about the church by subscribing to the Salt Lake Tribune's free Mormon Land newsletter. Just go to sltrib.com to sign up, and we'll talk again next time on Mormon Land.